Hi, it's Dwyer. It's November 19th, 2024. GamblersAdvisory.com, a free site. BettingAngle.us, a free site. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. You know what? The dam has broken. Folks, it's a new day in boxing. Netflix had a telecast, and to their surprise, because the system had a problem with the buffering, to their surprise, 60 million households showed up to watch Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson. Right now, folks, understand, that event was just the opening gambit. Because since that event took place, since Jake Paul, according to reports, made $40 million on that fight, Tyson is supposed to have cleared $20 million. And since there was a lot more money involved than that, you can imagine if they fold ads into the show and they come to you and you're a big-time advertiser, let's say you're Anheuser-Busch, or your Apple, and they come to you and they say, you know what, our last boxing show got 60 million households. Are you interested in helping underwrite this event? You're going to say, hell yeah. You're going to think to yourself, wow, you know, advertising on the Super Bowl's really expensive. Here, I can advertise on this event. Even the people who don't get Netflix are going to be curious about what happened on this event. It's not pay-per-view, right? This was standard fare for Netflix subscribers. You might want to taste. Understand, the more advertisers who are out there putting up money for this event, the bigger the purses that can be offered. So, since the Netflix event has taken place, undisputed champion Arthur Beterbiev has thrown his hat into the Jake Paul sweepstakes. Carl Froch has for a long time been talking about his desire to fight Jake Paul. Understand, you have a Hall of Famer, and you have the possibility of Jake Paul extending his brand to the United Kingdom. Froch, of course, already has fought in front of something like 80,000 people in an event at Wembley. You also have, and this is an intriguing one, the Bridgerweight champion. Bridgerweight goes up to 224. Understand, Jake Paul weighed in for the Tyson fight at 227. You have the Bridgerweight champion throwing his hat in the ring, Kevin Lerena, a guy who's already fought Daniel Dubois, a guy who got outmaneuvered by Justice Honey, right? In other words, there's a possibility you can beat Lerena with movement. The Honey fight is here online. He's thrown his hat in the ring. So think about the Jake Paul phenomenon. A champ at 175, a legit champ. In fact, the undisputed champ. And a champ at 224. Folks, that's a 49-pound swing. Both are calling out Jake Paul. And, of course, you have a guy who was at 168, a Hall of Famer, calling out a guy who weighed in at 227 and a quarter for his last fight. So let's offer some thoughts here, because I believe this is a big moment for boxing. Understand, Jake Paul is more than a fighter. He's an entire promotional outlet. He's an alternative to what's happening with Riyadh season. He's an alternative to Top Rank, to Queensberry. to Matchroom. Right, so let's talk about this here. And of course, the fighter the fighter Jake Paul wants is Canelo, who of course has said that he has no interest in fighting Jake Paul. Let's talk about the possibilities here. Now, Jake Paul, in my opinion, needs to stay outside the system. It's all or nothing, and he has the power. Let's think about Arthur Beterbiev's options. He just had a classic fight. Career-enhancing fight. A fight we're going to be talking about years later. A unification match against Dmitry Bivol, a guy who beat Canelo in the past. So you can imagine, Arthur Beterbiev has a lot of options. He's the man at 175, right? If you're bouts and you want legitimacy, hell, if you're any light heavyweight and you want to show the world you're the best, that road leads you to Beterbiev. Let's be clear on that. Beterbiev has all the options that a dominant fighter could have at 175. But 60 million households have never tuned in for any Beterbiev fight that I'm aware of. Understand what Jake Paul brings. He brings box office. He brings exposure. It's hard right now to avoid an article on that Jake Paul-Mike Tyson fight. Just try to avoid it. You go to a sports page. The fight happened days ago. There's going to be some article on Jake Paul and Mike Tyson. You're online. You're on X. There's going to be some article on Jake Paul and Mike Tyson. So even the real champions, the guys who are so proven that they are undisputed, want the exposure that comes with fighting Jake Paul. Beterbiev wants that exposure. This is a guy who's fought Anthony Yarde. This is a guy who's fought Callum Smith. This is a guy who fought Joe Smith. This is a guy who fought Dmitry Bivol. It's not like the guy has to convince any of us that he's willing to take on tough competition. But yet this guy, with little to prove, wants to fight Jake Paul. So Jake Paul doesn't have to stand in line. He doesn't have to fight to become anyone's mandatory. He has the kind of clout right now in this sport at this time with these big promoters. Did I forget to mention Oscar De La Hoya and Golden Boy? With all these big names in boxing, he has the clout to jump the line. He has the ability to get the attention of even the proven, like Arthur Beterbiev. Now here's why that Beterbiev-Jake Paul fight might not happen. The Jake Paul side of the equation. If you're Jake Paul, can you risk getting knocked out in a fight? I know it looked like he was risking it all fighting Mike Tyson, but then we found out Tyson no longer has any legs. Right? If you're Jake Paul, can you risk fighting a Beterbiev who will hunt you down relentlessly? Right? You run away, he's going to make it look like you're running away because he's going to be moving toward you with much better legs than Mike Tyson has right now. Understand, too, the risk involved, and it's substantial. Only one guy has gone the distance with him. In other words, the risk of getting knocked out fighting Arthur Beterbiev is substantial for any opponent, especially one who hasn't come close to fighting the Callum Smiths, the Anthony Yards, the Joe Smiths of the world. Right? Let's face it too, Jake Paul does have pretty good legs. But if Bivol wasn't able to completely avoid Beterbiev, what leads Jake Paul to believe that he can avoid Beterbiev? You know, let's think it through too. You know, Jake Paul is calling out Canelo. The weight class at which Canelo got his heaviest title was 175 when he beat Kovalev. Well, now you have the 175 guy saying, hey, I'll be your Huckleberry. Fight me. We'll set it up. You know that this is a brand extension opportunity as well, because Beterbiev is based out of Canada. In other words, this would be the kind of thing where Jake Paul extends his brand to Canada. They would track him, as you can imagine, from the time he lands at the airport. There'd be a buzz. This would be part of the Jake Paul World Tour. But again, the problem is, if Jake Paul gets destroyed, if Jake Paul looks like Joe Smith looked when he fought Beterbiev, and keep in mind, that's a reverse fight. Beterbiev traveled to the New York City tri-state area. Beterbiev fought Joe Smith in his backyard. Beterbiev fought Anthony Yard in his backyard. Neither guy went the distance. Right? Beterbiev is a wrecking ball. So if Joe Smith travels, if Jake Paul travels to Canada to fight Beterbiev in Montreal or Toronto, and if he gets destroyed like Joe Smith got destroyed, will Jake Paul still be able to pull 60 million households? I'm not sure. Let's switch it up. Let's talk about another possibility here. The Cobra, Carl Froch. Now, to understand Carl Froch, I believe you need to look at two fights. The Arthur Abraham fight. Understand, as tough as Carl Froch is, Carl Froch went into that fight thinking, I'm going to outbox this guy. And folks, he gives Abraham a boxing lesson. Carl Froch is in and out of the pocket. Carl Froch is on the right side and the left side of Arthur Abraham. Whatever you think about Carl Froch, understand this is a guy with serious boxing skills. However tough Carl Froch looks in a match, just understand if Carl Froch wanted to, he can get on his back foot and box the socks off most fighters. Right? Understand too, the second fight I want people to look at is Carl Froch against Lucien Boutte. Now, I thought Boutte was the better athlete. I expected Boutte to win that fight. I thought Boutte had the faster hand speed. Right? Carl Froch is skilled. He's not a top-level athlete. Right? He can't match some athletes in terms of physical attributes. I didn't think he'd be able to match Lucien Boutte in terms of physical attributes. But this was the Carl Froch who got in the pocket. This was the Carl Froch who came for dinner and never left. Right? Carl Froch opens it up, destroys Lucien Boutte. It's a roughhouse fight. Carl Froch might as well have brought the kitchen sink with him into the ring. He's rough and tumble. Bute gets hurt. Bute's not given an inch to recover. Carl Froch stops Lucien Bute. So understand, Carl Froch can be a smooth boxer or he can be a rough redneck. Prime Carl Froch would be a tough test for anyone. That's why he's in the Hall of Fame. Here's the problem, and it is a problem. Netflix is global. You have literally, as I make this video, millions of households in the United States who were disappointed by the action or lack of action in that Jake Paul, Mike Tyson fight. Right? Many of these people who bought the fight are casual fans. They might not know who some of the Hall of Famers from a prior era are. The other problem is the minute you say prior era, that's going to bring a lot of groans to a lot of people's faces. After this Mike Tyson debacle, people are going to say, well, I know Carl Froch had a Hall of Fame resume. I just read about that yesterday. But is this another old guy who's too old to be competitive against Jake Paul? I've already seen that script watching the Jake Paul-Mike Tyson fight. Is this going to be a fight like that? In other words, the problem with Carl Froch is just the age question. That George Groves fight was what, a decade ago? Right? It's an age question. Now people, particularly folks like me, who bet on Mike Tyson and lost on this fight, now folks are going to look at Carl Froch carefully. There are going to be some questions. Has he been hitting the gym? Has he been sparring? Right? I don't want some dude who's straight out of 24/7 fitness who hasn't been near a boxing ring. I need some assurance, since we all now are slowly starting to realize that Jake Paul has some boxing skills. Right? I need some reassurance that the older fighter from the prior generation is actually not just in shape, but he's in fighting shape. Let me just point out, though, that of all of the guys I'm naming here in this video, Carl Froch brings the best atmosphere. Right, folks? I've said this a few times here online. Ground zero for the heavyweight division, in my opinion, the glamour division in boxing, is the United Kingdom. This is a British era in top-end boxing. Right? One of the meccas of boxing. You saw it again when AJ fought Daniel Dubois. Is Wembley. Folks, that's a mecca. You want Jake Paul fighting a guy who can bring 70, 80,000 people with them into the arena. You want an atmosphere where you have in the arena people like AJ, Daniel Dubois, checking out the action. You want a pre-fight where there were a lot of members of the press. There were a lot of boxing cognoscente. There were a lot of trainers who might have comments on the fight. You're going to have a very hard time finding a better boxing press corps. And I'm not saying this press corps is always fair to boxers, but let's just say they know the boxers. Then the United Kingdom's press corps. Right? Carl Froch is a huge name in the United Kingdom. right? The question is whether it translates in the United States, right? So Jake Paul and Carl Froch have had some tough words, some very tough words online, right? My phone always rings at the wrong time. My bad. You know, they've had some very tough words online. Jake Paul is sounding like he doesn't want to fight Carl Froch. Let's just say this wouldn't be the first time in my life where a fighter has said, hey, I don't want to fight this guy, and then you blink and the two guys are in the ring. Right? The numbers add up. The market says we want this fight. But there are other concerns. If Jake Paul was 227 against Mike Tyson, and if Carl Froch was fighting at 168, at what weight would they fight? How would that work out? You have another problem. We'll call it a regulatory problem. Look, I don't want to see fighters juicing. I have no problem with, Ryan Garcia getting suspended for being busted for Osterin. By the way, a drug that's, to me, around boxing to the point where you heard me mention Lucien Boutte earlier in this video. He was once busted for Osterin. I don't have problems with some regulation. But let's just say in the UK, in my opinion, they overdo it a bit, don't they? Right? It's like, guys are getting thrown out of the sport for 2 years at a clip. The Conor Benn situation, and I don't believe Conor Benn's side of the ledger, but I'm surprised that that situation has lingered as long as it has. One of my fears is that someone is going to say, hey, should we allow this fight? One, because Carl Froch has been out of the ring for a number of years. Two, because Jake Paul is really a guy with an unproven record. Right? And you can see a regulatory body saying, hey, we have concerns that this guy thinks he's ready to fight a Hall of Famer. Right? So if you're Jake Paul, fighting in Wembley is enticing. But be prepared for dealing with the British Boxing Board. So let's talk about another guy, Kevin Lerena. Now he's at 224. Here's the problem with Kevin Lerena from a boxing standpoint. He's a southpaw. Is Jake Paul ready to fight a southpaw with power who put down Daniel Dwyer multiple times? Right? Understand. Honey did keep Lerena changing direction. If you're Jake Paul and you look at the Honey fight, you're thinking, hey, maybe I can make Kevin Lerena change direction. Maybe I can beat this guy with some of the circular movement that I showed against Mike Tyson. But is Jake Paul experienced enough to know how to deal with a power punching southpaw? Folks, I'm just telling you, many fighters aren't. How did Joe Joyce fare when he faced Zhilei Zhang? Keep in mind, Joyce had beaten Joe Parker before that fight. Joyce was the mandatory contender. He hopped in the ring against a power-punching southpaw, and he had no idea what he was doing. Right? Andy Ruiz, hand speed for days. Right? Has enough hand speed to have won big fights, right? Including that first AJ fight. He hopped in the ring against Luis Ortiz, a name I keep mentioning here. Ortiz, I believe, is 45 years old now. Ortiz in his 40s. against, in my opinion, still the fastest hands in the heavyweight division. Gave Andy all he could handle. You know, it's a big if, right? Obviously, knockouts matter. But if Ortiz doesn't hit the canvas multiple times in that fight, in my opinion, he would have won on the scorecards because he outboxes Andy Ruiz. Is Jake Paul going to be in the ring against Kevin Lerena and be unable to deal with Kevin Lerena's southpaw stance? Right? Understand, Lerena, and I know he has a KO percentage a smidge under 50%, but his nickname is the KO Kid. If he lands flush on you, he can drop you. If Jake Paul fights him, right, and if you believe size matters, where, you know, Lerena, because he's in a bridgerweight weight class that goes up to 224, might have a bigger punch than Carl Froch, than Arthur Beterbiev. Right? If you believe so, and if you're advising Jake Paul, do you have him in against a guy who's not as well known as the Cobra, or as Beterbiev, right? Or as Canelo, but who might have the biggest punch of all of them just because of size, and who would be the same weight as Jake Paul if Jake Paul decides to come in at the bridgerweight level? Right? Well, let's just say it's Jake Paul's call to make. Because all of these guys, Beterbiev, Froch, Lerena, all of them want to fight him. Let me add a caveat here too. At cruiser, Gilberto Ramirez, in my eyes, and he's unified now at cruiser, not undisputed. Jay Obitaya still has a share of the title. But Gilberto Ramirez, who's been at cruiser for about 5 minutes, and already he's picked up 2 belts. Right? Chris Billum Smith was on a winning streak against impressive opposition. Ramirez just beat him. Right? The problem with fighting a Gilberto Ramirez is that he's one of the most skilled boxers in the sport. In my eyes, as I've said here, he's one of the best body punchers in the sport. If he wants, he could stay outside. He has one of the better jabs in the sport. Right now, many people don't know about Ramirez, whose nickname is Zordo. But understand, one of the problems with Ramirez is the same problem you have with Lerena. Ramirez is a southpaw. I feel Ramirez is too advanced for Jake Paul. Right now, what do I know? I had Tyson over Jake Paul. But here again, I think Ramirez is too advanced for Jake Paul. The problem with Opetaya, and it's a southpaw world right now, he's also a southpaw, is that Ramirez is a bit of a gentleman in the ring. By the way, as Jake Paul just was. Right? Jake Paul, in interviews after the fight, said he didn't go for the knockout against Mike Tyson because he didn't think it was necessary. You know who would go for the knockout? Jay Opetaya. This is the quick twitch southpaw with an attitude. Right? Opetaya is relentless when he wants to be. I get the feeling Opetaya, just personality-wise, my view from the cheap seats, is Opetaya would feel offended that some guy who comes across as a dilettante would think that he belongs in the ring with Opetaya. Opetaya, of course, is a former Olympian. Right? And Opetaya fought Maris Briedis, a very tough out, twice. Beat him twice. Right? Opetaya is the guy who got his jaw broken and still won that first Maris Briedis fight. Right? If Opetaia gets the upper hand, oh, that could look bad. Right? A guy who has a chip on his shoulder starts to undress you in the ring. Right? Opetaia is the guy who knocks you down and looks at you when you're on the canvas. Right? Let's just say there is some Sonny Liston, in my opinion, in Jay Opetaia. Right? He's also fast. And of course, he's a guy who has better legs than than Jake Paul. Right? So I get the feeling Jake Paul is not going to want to mention Gilberto Ramirez, southpaw, Jay Opetaia, southpaw. He might not mention Kevin Lerena, southpaw. Right? You know, he's mentioning other guys at weights that are much lower than 227. Right? If he's going to fight a Beterbiev, if he's going to fight a Cobra, weight's going to have to be discussed and addressed. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours. If there are others out there who you want to see Jake Paul in against, tell us about it in the comment section of this YouTube video. I feel that Carl Froch would bring Wembley with him. Tens of thousands of fans with him. I think the live event would be off the chain. I think Beterbiev is bringing the undisputed status with him. Understand, that fight could be a win-win for everyone, because Jake Paul would be able to say, hey, I'm fighting an undisputed champion. Beterbiev might be able to say, even if I lose this fight, I keep all my titles because we're not fighting at 175. Right? Just food for thought. In other words, the downside risk is minimized for Beterbiev, as it likely wouldn't be sanctioned as a title bout. Right? Jake Paul hasn't been fighting at 175, quite frankly. He wouldn't qualify to fight the champion. Right? He's ineligible to be a mandatory. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comment section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.